Jihad in Gaza, Assad in Syria, and Shiite militias in Iraq. In fact, weeks ago, Iran attempted a killer drone attack on Israeli soil from Syria. We're seeing an increasingly bold, borderless, and portable Iranian foreign legion, all targeting Israel and American allies in the region. Here to discuss the latest from Jerusalem is my friend Ambassador Ron Dermer. Ron is one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's closest confidants, in addition to being Israel's ambassador to the United States. He previously worked as a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and co-authored with Natan Sharansky in 2004 the best-selling book, The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror. Before becoming ambassador in 2013, he first served as Israel's Minister of Economic Affairs in the United States and later as senior advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Ambassador Dennis Ross, a co-founder of UANI, I'm very proud of that, and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who will moderate our session. There is no more knowledgeable, experienced, or wise man in this area than Dennis. There's no more gracious and generous person with that knowledge, and he is a mentor to me and everyone else that I know. He served as a special assistant to President Barack Obama on the National Security Council and as the U.S. point man in the Middle East peace process during both Bush and Clinton administrations. And he, believe it or not, served as the head of policy planning a long time ago, but I think I'm dating you with that, Dennis. Please, and he also has a book out now that's getting very great attention. It's entitled Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leader Shaped Destiny. It's Destiny, thank you, along with Mr. Mikovsky. So, David Mikovsky. So anyway, I will turn it over to my two friends here, and please welcome them. Join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here, and actually, Ron, very good to be with you. This is a topic that Ron and I have. And you want to hear me too.
You got to just project.
I can do that.
I don't get it.
Hear me now? I do commercials as well, you know. I was going to say, this is a topic that Ron and I have almost never discussed, so it really gives us an opportunity. Ron, look, I want to start by just...
I have to say, he's the most agreeable person to disagree with on planet Earth.
Mutual. So let me start by just posing the following question. The administration has adopted a policy that it calls maximum pressure. I sometimes prefer to call it sort of maximum economic pressure. I guess the question I would start with is, we've seen that it is certainly squeezing the Iranians economically, although there are still signs that even though they have reduced the amount of money they provide to Hezbollah, they're still providing a significant amount. And when I talk to some of the security people in Israel, they tell me there's actually more money going to Hamas right now. How would you judge the effectiveness of the administration's policy at this point?
So before I answer that, first I want to thank UANI for the work that you do. I think you just got a wonderful testimonial to how important your work is, because how concerned Iran is by it. And so hopefully you will wear that as a badge of honor, and you will redouble your efforts, because I don't think they could be more important at a more important time. So thank you for all you do and all the support. All of you who are supporters of this great organization, thank you for supporting it. Now, about the maximum pressure campaign, I think it's working very well. In fact, I think it's working much better than a lot of people expected. I'm old enough to remember a year and a half ago where people said that if the United States would withdraw from the nuclear deal with Iran, that there really would not be a tough sanctions regime, because why was the sanction regime so tough before? Because the entire world was part of that sanction regime. And they said if the U.S. goes it alone, you're never going to have the pressure that you had under the Obama administration. And that has proven to be totally false. It's good to go read, in the age of the internet, you can actually pull up quotes of people saying what will happen if the U.S. goes it alone. This has been a dramatic shift, and the biggest impact of this maximum pressure policy, it hasn't changed yet Iran's behavior, and we can talk about it. It hasn't forced Iran to the point where they're willing to really end their nuclear ambitions. I don't think we're close to there, but it has starved the world's most dangerous regime of billions, tens of billions, and ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars if they continue with this policy. And I'll explain why. Something very important was said by Secretary of State Pompeo about the United States taking about $50 billion, $50 billion off the table from Iran. So how does he get, I think, how he gets to that number. I'll explain why. You remember when the deal was signed, there was a $50 billion or $100 billion or $150 billion signing bonus, and there was a big debate over exactly how much money that was? That was the signing bonus of the deal. That wasn't the big money given to Iran. A lot of people also said something that was wrong at the time, that Iran's getting all the money up front. It didn't. It got certain money, 50, 100, or 150, that was frozen in bank accounts. It was Iranian oil sales that they could not repatriate back to Iran. That was the signing bonus of the deal. The big money in the deal is the ability to sell oil. Now, go back to the beginning of the Trump administration. It wasn't until October of his first year where he said he wouldn't recertify the deal. And it was in May the following year where he actually made the decision to restore sanctions. Now, when he made that decision, whether it was May or June, I don't remember exactly what month it was, Iran was exporting 2.8 million barrels a day. Now, today, the numbers are under 500,000. I don't know if it's 200 or 300 or 400. There's different estimates because of how you measure how much the Chinese are buying or not buying.
How much is leaking through, but basically
how much is leaking through. But let's say it's 500,000. That's over 2 million barrels a day that Iran is not selling. Now, what is the price of oil this morning? $65? 65. That's $130 million a day. That's almost $4 billion a month. That is $50 billion a year. Now, 10 or 15 years of this deal, if Iran can sell oil at 3 million barrels a day, means that they would have over between $500 billion to $750 billion over those 10 or 15 years. That's if you don't get new investment, because Iran was once exporting about 4 million barrels a day. So Iran, this deal was going to give Iran $1 trillion. Now, I'd love to tell you that Iran was going to use that money to establish a GI Bill for returning members of the Revolutionary Guard. But what they were doing was fueling their war machine in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen. And basically what the administration's policy has done, which is a huge achievement, it has starved this regime of the fuel for its war machine. And I actually think one of the best pieces of evidence that the administration's strategy is working is that Iran has actually changed its strategy. Now they are lashing out in order to get the United States to change its policies. People who think that all of a sudden Iran is doing these terror acts in the region, or the Saudi oil facilities, going after, let's say, the drone, and other drone attacks in the region, and targeting various different things, the tankers. A lot of people were pretending as if Iran was not engaging in nefarious behavior throughout the region for the last 3 or 4 years. This did not start in May. What was new in May, the United States made an important decision to get rid of the waivers for the oil. So now the strategy...
Eight countries were permitted under the waivers to be able to buy oil from the Iranians. And on May 4th, the U.S. withdrew those waivers 1 week before they announced they were going to do it. Then you did see what you're describing. Then they had their, as you put it, nefarious activities, as the administration refers to, line activities, were at a certain level, ongoing. Starting after that, they ratcheted up because they're now adopting a version of their own.
No, I don't think they ratcheted up. I think they did not a quantitative change, a qualitative change. They continued the same malign activities they were doing before. Look, we were having to confront them in Syria for 3, 4, 5 years. Absolutely. Same thing in Lebanon when they're trying to give Hezbollah more sophisticated weapons. In Yemen, that was a problem that extends many, many years. So they continued all those activities. In fact, after the JCPOA was signed, they increased those activities. What they're doing now is a new strategy specifically designed to get the international community to change its policy, and the policy right now is directed to get oil sales down to zero. Now remember, when you had sanctions under the Obama regime, under the Obama administration, excuse me, they were allowing them 1 million barrels a day. Now we're at 250, so these sanctions are much, much stronger than they ever were. And it's only because the United States administration has basically given a choice to countries around the world. You can choose to do business with our American economy, which is $21 trillion, or with Iran's economy, which is $400 billion. You make the choice. So it doesn't really matter that European political leaders say we're not going to be part of these sanctions, because European businesses are part of it. So it's German banks, or French car companies, or British Airlines, and other companies are leaving Iran. Now with the decision that the Secretary of State made today regarding Chinese sanctions, I think you're going to see more of that. And Iran is under an enormous amount of pressure, and it's important not to let up the pressure. You remember, just one final point on this. When the interim agreement was signed, which was in 2013, which ultimately led to a deal in 2015, one of the arguments at the time was Iran has been under sanctions for a decade, and it hasn't affected the trajectory of their nuclear program. But the truth is, they were not under tough sanctions for a decade. Tough sanctions began only 13 months before, when you finally had the oil and banking sanctions. But now you have crippling sanctions. So you went from a year of tough sanctions, where the administration basically, I think, gave up its leverage, went into the negotiations, basically made an agreement at the beginning of the negotiations that Iran could keep its nuclear infrastructure, and the question was how much for how long. It had made the big concession in October of 2013.
That was really when, even though they didn't say they were accepting enrichment, the truth is they accepted enrichment because that was really the purpose of the negotiation for the JCPOA.
But you did not have tough sanctions for a decade. You had tough sanctions, which got them down to 1 million for about a year. Now we're in a position where we've only had this sanction regime in place. It started a year ago May. A year in May it started to dwindle down, and now it was ratcheted up in May. The next step was taken. So you basically have 16 months under crippling sanctions that are now starting to have an effect. And the most important thing right now is to stay the course. If you're going to get any deal that's going to be acceptable, you have to continue to stay the course and keep up the pressure, and more countries around the world should join that effort.
All right, so let's drill down a little bit. I agree, it is quite right. In my mind, what we've seen since May on the Iranian side is a qualitatively new approach, in the sense that before it seemed to me that they felt, okay, now outlast Trump. They'll keep doing what they're doing, but they won't walk away from the JCPOA. They'll try to ensure that the Europeans remain closer to them than to the administration. And then with the waivers being revoked, then they said, now we have to put much more pressure on. And now, so there's a tension here between staying the course, which requires a strategic patience, and making sure that others don't give in to that pressure. So the question I have for you is, as you look at what's going on now, particularly given the strike on the most important Saudi petroleum processing facility, that should create an opening to create a much broader coalition. By the way, not simply because the Iranians have crossed the threshold. Normally they do things through indirection. This was not done through indirection. This was done directly. So they crossed the threshold. It's not just that it's an attack on a petroleum facility that is the most important one in Saudi Arabia. It's that if there's no response to this, the message internationally is there are no rules. Anything goes. So this should create an opening to be able to mobilize the kind of collective response that it seems that you're actually getting at. So the question I have for you is, do you see signs of that happening?
Well, you saw a sign in the fact that the British, the French, and the Germans are pointing the finger where it should be pointed. But I'm still a little bit skeptical of how much they're going to join the U.S. Because, look, the European position towards Iran has been one of containment of its program and accommodating its behavior in the region. The U.S. position is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear military capability and trying to roll back the aggression. It's fundamentally different. And so the question becomes, how can you square the circle between If only people in Iran had a right to protest freely at their hotels. If only people in Iran could go on Facebook and Twitter. The people of Iran want to be free. We'll talk about it, but I want to say something because we talked about a maximum pressure campaign. A real campaign to get Iran to fundamentally change all of its behavior has definitely include that economic pressure. And there definitely has to be a credible military threat. But there's a third component that is, in my view, equally important, and that is to reach out directly to the people of Iran. And the people of Iran are our partners. I think they're Israel's partners. I think they're America's partners. I think they're the free world's partners. They hate this regime. And one of the things that hopefully Europeans and others can do is stand up for freedom by reaching out directly to all those dissidents in Iran that are languishing in its prisons and all those people who don't have a right to protest. That's one of the things that the Europeans can do tomorrow in actually sitting down and rushing to do meetings with a regime that is oppressing its own people, that is hanging gays from cranes, that is now allowing women to take off a headscarf. If they would actually reach out to the dissidents of Iran, then we could peacefully resolve this issue much faster.
That's what we are here representing the people of Iran. We stand with Israel. We stand with all the people around the world to stand with us and protect us from this regime.
Thank you.
This regime, the Persian people, they are minority, and we are the majority. The ethnic people living in Iran, they've been persecuted for a long time. And that's why we are here. We wait in campaigning all the world to be with us. Please. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we've had an example of, you know what?
Everybody knows Iran is terrorist country. More than 80 million people live in Iran, and Iranian government is cash all that people. Please, we say for every democratic help for us and support for any Iranian people.
So we do have audience participation here, and I would say,
Yeah, I tell you something. One of my mentors, I wrote a book with him, which is his. I just translated his Gulagian English into something Americans could understand. Is Natan Sharansky, who was a great dissident in the Soviet Union. And it's very interesting. I asked him when the JCPOA was signed. I said, why are there dissidents in Iran who supported it? Not all of them. There were some who did, very prominent ones. Many did not. And I said there are dissidents who supported it because the dissidents in the Soviet Union all rejected the policy of détente. They were the hardliners against it, saying the world should not be embracing this regime, they shouldn't be courting it in any way, they shouldn't be trying to engage it in any way, they should be confronting it. And he said to me something very interesting, right, that I asked him. He said, because many people in Iran believe that this agreement will actually help them and will lead to the opening of Iran because their revolution had not even gone 40 years. He said they're where the Soviet dissidents were in the 1950s, which was around 35 to 40 years after the revolution. He said they're going to realize very soon that all the regime will do from this deal is they're going to take all that money and use it to continue to repress its people and to fuel its aggression in the region. And then in a few short years, they're all going to understand that you have to confront this regime, not court it. And I think that what you hear today, I think there are millions and millions of people within Iran who believe the exact same thing.
so let me pick up on that. Look, we had an example here of free speech in the United States. And you made, I think, a very compelling point. Wouldn't it be great if Iranians had the ability to do something similar to that? But you also talked about the Europeans reaching, I will say not just to dissidents, but in a sense, those who would like to change Iran. My question to you is, what are the practical ways that the Europeans, or for that matter, the administration, the U.S. administration, should be reaching out?
Is give legitimacy to people who represent this voice within Iran. I mean, in 2009, when people went into the streets of Iran, I mean, they all were protesting this regime, and they had no support from the outside world. None. And I think what you have to do is a consistent policy, just like there's somebody in the administration, the U.S. administration has done a fantastic job on the economic pressure side of it. The Treasury of the United States works every day, cross-agency, to think about what can we do to further starve this regime of the funds that it's using for its campaign. I think a lot of bright people should be sitting around thinking, how do we reach out to our partners within Iran? Not trying how we're going to get this or that meeting with this or that leader of Iran that doesn't represent his own people, but as people of Iran, how do we reach out directly to them? And if Europe and the United States do that together and will not give legitimacy to people who repress the people of Iran, will not grant them that legitimacy, will not run after them for meetings, but will actually meet with the dissidents, will actually talk about somebody who's sitting in Iran, a woman who's been in prison for years. If the leaders of the United States, of France, of Britain, and Germany put those people on the map, you will be protecting them. You will be forcing the regime to take those people seriously. That's why that helped Natan Sharansky when he was sitting in the Gulag in the Soviet Union. What happened? You had a leader like Ronald Reagan at the time who called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And a lot of people were appalled. All the diplomats around the world were appalled, said that he was going to lead to sort of World War III. And you know who was celebrating? The dissidents in the prisons. Because they said, finally, there's a leader who's calling it like it is and calling this it is an evil empire. And Iran is an evil empire in our region, and I think it should be called out as such, and your partners are the people in Iran.
We don't have a lot of time left. There's a couple of questions I still want to pose. We haven't talked. You mentioned China in terms of
these people are more awake now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to have a quiz soon, though, too. So, look, so you mentioned that Secretary Pompeo, what he said about China. Don't you think that maybe with China there actually is a kind of I mean, think about the fact they get so much of their oil from the region. The Iranians have just been responsible for carrying out an attack on the most important Saudi facility. Wouldn't this be a moment where the Chinese, in fact, for their own reasons, might find this is the right time to be putting pressure on the Iranians?
See, look, what I've seen happen internationally for the last 20 years when it came to getting international support for sanctions, first of all, it's all been a function of having a credible military threat. It's something a lot of people don't understand. The reason why the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russians have joined sanctions effort is because they didn't want to see potential military action. The truth is, if you ask countries around the world what's worse, a potential military confrontation with Iran or a nuclear-armed Iran, they think actually a military confrontation is worse. Now, if you have a policy of prevention, both of them are bad, but it's clear which one is worse. And what has happened over the last 20 years with sanctions is when the international community saw that the United States, or the United States and Israel, were determined to take action, potential military action, they rushed to join a sanctions campaign. George W. Bush got 3 UN Security Council sanctions passed. Why? Because they thought after he had gone to Afghanistan and Iraq, there would be a possibility that he might action against Iran, and they wanted to join a sanctions campaign actually to thwart that. And you remember when you were in the Obama administration, where our national security advisor was sent to one of the countries you mentioned with a clear...
As was I.
Yeah, with a clear message that if you guys don't get on board the sanctions, don't be surprised if U.S. and/or take action. And they went and they took action. So I think if you're going to get the other countries in the world on board, you must make clear that there will be a credible action that may be taken, a military action. And the Iranis keeps on challenging. They keep on poking and poking and poking and poking. So you might be right. It might be the Chinese and the Russians will be worried about Iran going too far and might actually be able to join something now. We'll have to see.
So in effect, what you're also suggesting is there needs to be strategic patience. Hold the line, keep the pressure up.
Absolutely.
So in the meantime, it's not just what the Iranians do in the region. Now they're incrementally walking away from the JCP. Now, what they're indicating that the next move is going to be is that they will start enriching to around 20%.
Now, what I have to tell you, Dennis, I'm having a tough time understanding why anybody is that concerned about what Iran is doing in terms of moving away from the JCPOA commitments. You know, so it did with levels of enrichment, different moves that it's making to sort of push the envelope a little bit on the JCPOA and started to violate it. I'm trying to understand why the Europeans and others are concerned about that, because they made a deal that allows Iran to do this very thing in a few years. Understand, the core problem with the deal was that it has a certain number of years where Iran cannot do this. So everything that Iran is doing right now in violation of its JCPOA commitments, they can do it legally with the blessing of the international community in a few years. So all they're doing is doing it sooner. The international community made an agreement with Iran, a nuclear deal that does not solve the problem. What it does is, in a few years, as I say, it removes these restrictions on Iran's nuclear program.
On 2030.
And allows them, no, that's the last one.
No, but the ones they're doing right now, enriching above 3.67%, 2030.
Right. But what they could do under this deal,
more than 300
as you know,
2030.
they can start putting in centrifuges according to this deal in 10 years. And one thing that Senator Lieberman said earlier, he said this deal sort of paused Iran's nuclear program, if that. And the if that was very important. It didn't pause Iran's nuclear program. Iran is allowed to do, under this deal, R&D on advanced centrifuges during this deal. 140 or 50-page document that was called the JCPOA, my favorite line, in quotes, was that over the next decade, Iran can only do R&D on the IR 2, 4, 6, and 8. That's like telling Apple that over the next decade, it can only do R&D on the iPhone 12, 13, 14, and 15. It's funny, but it's a tragedy. It was a great act of appeasement to allow Iran to continue to advance its nuclear weapons program under this deal. And they won't need to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They will just walk into the nuclear club. That is what the deal does. It also gave them all of this money, which has fueled their campaigns in the region.
So I was trying to get at also what I think has been the Israeli posture. I recall when Prime Minister Netanyahu came here and said 20% was a kind of threshold, that if the Iranians one bomb's worth at 20%, that was a threshold. I don't think he said red line, but he...
Oh, he put the red line at the UN. I think it was pretty bold.
Well, yeah. All right, so...
Wasn't the most subtle drawing of a red line in history.
Actually, it was pretty stark.
That's right.
But okay, but that really is my question. So let's say they start producing it. Say they reduce their breakout time down to a very short period of time, because, in a sense, you've got a strategic patience posture on the one hand, and they may be going back and accelerating what they're then doing under the nuclear program on the other. We have now, I know you paid attention to the early election, we have what is probably going to be a national unity government. Certainly the two leading proponents, they may have a different definition of what that looks like, but they both are calling for national unity. Let's say the scenario I'm painting is one that begins to emerge. Would you expect that a new national unity government would have posture that Israel has had on Iran?
Look, yeah, I think the question is whether or not a new government in Israel would have the same posture we've had in the past. Well, look, everyone understands the Prime Minister, I think, has been more than any person in the world, has made it clear that everything has to be done to prevent Iran from ever developing nuclear weapons. And I think his commitment to do so is just as strong today as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or any time over the last 20 years, which he has been calling on the international community to address this issue. And had the United States and Israel not worked together over Iran would have had a nuclear weapon a long time ago. So I think the Prime Minister's determination is not in question. As for, yes, I can hear myself, so. As for, I think this may be for you. As for the head of the party, yes, Benny Gantz, a former IDF chief of staff, he made clear in Munich earlier this year that when it comes to a Munich Security Conference, and when it comes to Iran, he said there was no difference between me and the Prime Minister. And I think Israelis are united. in making sure that everything is done to prevent developing a nuclear weapon. Now, you remember when the deal was signed in 2000, or not signed, but when the deal was made in 2015, you could find security and intelligence officials in Israel. They were all, every single one of them was sort of mobilized for this campaign. You could find them who would say that this deal is better than the alternative. Thankfully, in Israel, we're not run by generals. We have a civilian leadership, and the Prime Minister expressed our view of the dangers of such a deal. But there were security and intelligence officials at that time in 2015 who thought it was better than the alternatives. When President Trump withdrew from the, there were even then some security and intelligence officials who said, you know what, don't withdraw by yourself from the deal, because they were concerned that if the U.S. withdrew just by itself, that you wouldn't be able to maintain this strong sanctions regime, which has proven to be incorrect. Today, you cannot find security and intelligence officials in Israel, I'm not aware of them, that would go back to the exact same deal. The United States has gotten enormous leverage. And I think the idea of going back into the same deal with Iran that gives them a clear path to nuclear weapons, that doesn't actually solve or close the one file it was supposed to close, and you're having to deal with all these other problems, would be a big mistake. And I think that is overwhelmingly supported by the people of Israel. And I think any new government that would be established would support that position and would call for continued pressure, continued sanctions to ensure A, that Iran never gets nuclear weapons, and B, that everything be done to roll back Iran's aggression in the region. It's not a problem for Israel that's thousands of miles away. It's right on our doorstep. You see it in Lebanon, you see it in Syria, we see it in Gaza, and it's right on our neighbor's doorstep. And Israel here, one thing has been said by many people that the nuclear deal did, is it did bring Israel and our Arab neighbors closer together, because we are both the same enemy. Iran is confronting them, it's confronting us, and hopefully one of the positive things that can come out of this nuclear deal and what has happened over the last few years has been that Israel and the Arab world can find a way to finally bring this relationship that is getting stronger behind the scenes, right, to bring it into the sunshine, because I think that's long overdue.
So I think I'm getting a sign that we're out of time. Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Can I ask one more question or no? There's a trap door here and it opens up and pulls us. All right, one more question. Look, the one last question I have. President Trump has made it clear that he wants to negotiate with the Iranians, and clearly he wants to do what might be called, I don't know if it's JCPOA 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever standpoint. What's the one element that you feel is most important in any deal that would emerge, if there in fact there is a deal?
The main flaw in the deal was always the sunset clause, the fact that all of this is temporary. So that is the one problem that because you can either, the best thing would be to get rid of all of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That is actually Israel's policy. There's no reason for Iran to have any enrichment on its soil. If they wanted peaceful nuclear energy, they can do that without enriching uranium or having plutonium. It's not the people of Iran, it's not like life, liberty, and the pursuit of plutonium. They don't need it in order to have peaceful nuclear energy. So there's no reason for Iran to have a single centrifuge, to have a heavy water facility or anything like that. That would be the best solution. A solution that Israel could live with was if you are going, and the Prime Minister said this in his speech to Congress in 2015, if you're going to leave them with any infrastructure, you cannot make these temporary. They have to be permanent, these constraints, because if you don't make them permanent, what will happen is Iran would be able to enrich uranium legally, and then the breakout times will go down to essentially zero, which is under the deal. That happens in about year 12, which is now only about 7 or 8 years away. And then, as I said, Iran doesn't sneak in or break in. So if you're going to resolve the one problem that you have to address is you have to prevent Iran from ever being a military nuclear power. And if you have a sunset clause, that's a date certain for when Iran would be a military nuclear power, and that has enormous consequences for our region. Now, if you solve that one problem, if you did a nuclear deal that actually dealt with, you'd still have other problems with Iran, but that's not the core problem of the deal. That's the thing that has to be addressed, and that's the thing that's most important for Israel.
Okay, I would like you to join me in thanking Ron Dermer.
Thank you.
And I think the next thing is on the program.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Mr. Trump. Do you think Iran might time and hope Mr. Trump will be one term and then go back to normal and lose the pressure?
Thank you all very much. A reminder, obviously,